Welcome to another episode of Aging Gracefully, a talk show for Evergreens. The question that we're going to discuss today is, are you feeling lonely and unproductive? To help us with this talk, we are joined again by our distinguished panel of guests, Father Juvi and Dr. John. For those who are joining us for the first time, Father Juvi is a well-known Redemptorist who served as in the General Council in Rome and is a scripture professor. Dr. John is a physician and he is an alumnus from Harvard and MIT US and the CEO of BIV Educational Organization. We are also joined by our lovely audience. It's wonderful to have all of you here. Studies show that 1 in every 3 adults experience loneliness. With COVID-19 shutdowns, people have been driven into their homes and have increased physical isolation. I am sure that many of you all have experienced loneliness one time or the other in your lives. Father Juvi, you would have come across many people going through this experience of loneliness. What would you say to them?
Thanks for that question, and it's good to be back again with all of you on the sets of Growing Old Gracefully. Yeah, loneliness is something that's too large to ignore. Sometimes it's called the unseen epidemic because it is, you could say, global, and no single group is excluded from it. I found it interesting that in the year 2018, in the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister announced a minister for loneliness. In fact, that same year, allocated a budget of something like £26 million so that this ministry would establish and maintain contact with people. Perhaps they named the problem that they could address, because this is a problem that's not only global, but because it is global because it is local. We might say, as you said, 1 in 3 persons or 33% people at some stage or the other claim to be lonely. But that's a statistic. And statistics don't speak to us. It's when we put a name and a face to people who are lonely, that's when it hits. And the reality of that loneliness cuts across all sorts of people. And we've all learned to mask our loneliness to some extent or the other. Okay? You find this kind of loneliness in dysfunctional families, in abusive relationships, in troubled marriages, that you might be surrounded with people and yet feel so lonely. And of course, it's part of growing old. The golden ages, as we might like to call ourselves. And so this is a reality that cuts across every group, every continent, every country. And it is this that we've got to grapple with. And I'm glad we've taken a theme like this, because this, I'm sure, is going to speak to so many people. Now, I'm aware that we are doing this in the shadow of this wonderful feast of Christmas. We call it a family feast, and so many families get together. But it is also a feast like this which reveals sometimes the loneliness of certain families. Particularly if you have aged parents, they're waiting for their children to come home, time to be with them, and plans most often are made. And elderly parents rejoice when they have these children. But sometimes because of emergencies or other factors, these expectations are not met. Maybe they were not real or realistic. But the fact of the matter is that you do miss your loved ones in what we like to call Christmas, the family feast. But let's understand Christmas for what it is. Because we have our understanding of God who comes to be among us and with us. Now, you must understand in the Old Testament, the whole of the Old Testament, people said, you cannot see the face of God and live. So, on one hand, you want to believe in God, but at the other hand, you found that this God, although dear, loving, was quite remote, quite distant. And that's why through the Old Testament, particularly the prophet Isaiah, the people are yearning, they're crying out, oh, that you would tear the heavens and come down. It's like we want this God to be near us, around us, surrounding us. And this cry of the people, echoed by Isaiah, was made real as a response with the coming of Jesus. I love that phrase in St. John's Gospel. He has pitched his tent among us. It's like he's made his dwelling among us. And that wonderful name, Emmanuel, God with us. Just listen to these words. I would like to call that an antidote to loneliness. Because we felt ourselves so remote, so far, so distant, so removed. And that's the beauty of it. Now, for some people, it's too good to be true. In fact, for the Jews, it was a scandal. How can God make God so little as to become human and fragile and vulnerable? For the Greeks, it was something unbelievable, stupidity. Why would God want to demean himself from the king of the cosmos and the universe and then become somebody so subject? And why would God want to do that? And that beautiful text at John 3:16, God loved the world so much that he gave his only son not to condemn, but to save. In fact, our founder of the Redemptor, St. Alphonsus Liguri, had that beautiful phrase. He said, God is so crazily in love with us. Pazzo per amore. Sounds so beautiful in his original language. The crazy things we do for love. That's who our God is. And that's what we celebrate at Christmas. Not a fat, overgrown fellow with a white beard and a white hair like mine. Ho, 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 Santa Claus. No, the focus is Jesus, whose name is Emmanuel. As I said, I'd like to see that very name as the antidote to loneliness. And the more we allow this image to swim in our brain, the more we allow this name, Emmanuel, to re-echo in our ears, and the more we allow this experience of Emmanuel to rest in our hearts, it's the assurance that this God comes to us to hold our hands, especially when we feel our loneliness. I think this season is really meant to address a theme and a topic that you've raised up for us all.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Father Juvi. Loneliness is vulnerability, and that's a very thing. Dr. John, Father Juvi has spoken on pastoral and spiritual perspective. As a physician, how would you, address this topic?
Yeah. Firstly, it's lovely to be back on the sets for Aging Gracefully and have the audience and talk about this very, very important topic. As physicians, we deal with a whole range of patients who come from different age groups. It'd be very interesting that most often it is people who you think have the busy life, who have a lot of friends, who tend to be the most lonely. And when I answer this question, I'll keep my answer limited more to the context of the elderly population, since that's what the main theme of the discussion today is. In terms of symptoms, when patients come to us, it's very interesting that many of these symptoms are very similar to the symptoms associated with depression.
Yes.
Invariably, we have people coming to us who have trouble sleeping. There are changes in their appetite, changes in their mood. The moods tend to swing from extremes. They also have issues in terms of being highly insecure. Many of them show up quite shabbily dressed, and because the basic feeling of taking care of themselves isn't there. This feeling of despondency and not being wanted. And what's also very, very interesting is that there are so many different variables when you talk about loneliness. For instance, you can look at the gender difference itself. Studies have been done in Canada which say that the prevalence of loneliness is more among women than in men. And some of the reasons they give for that is generally women tend to have deeper relationships more personal relationships with their friends. And when life incidents happen, like when they lose a friend, a colleague, it tends to affect them more, and they tend to be more lonely. Similarly, I think women are more expressive in terms of their emotions, and the very fact that they feel lonely, they tend to express that a lot more. Right? Men, on the other hand, tend to keep things to themselves, aren't very, very social or expressive of their emotions. Now, this is a study done in Canada. Incidentally, a similar study was done in Devnahalli, that's the outskirts of Bangalore, right? And there they realized that what they were hearing and seeing was the prevalence of loneliness was more among the men than the women. And when the researchers actually analyzed the reasons behind it, they realized that in the villages, women tend to go out together to the fields, spend a lot of time together, talk about what's happening, do a little bit of gossiping, talk about their worries, unload, come back. On the other hand, you had the men who would interact with each other at a very superficial level. And in many instances, men, as they aged, were no longer the sole breadwinners of their family. So they felt that the respect they got both at home and outside was a lot less once their ability to learn had diminished. And that's one of the main reasons why they reported feelings of loneliness more among men. The other very interesting aspect when you talk about loneliness is the way it presents, depending on the age group of the person, is very, very different. Right? Yeah. And not only just the age group, the health condition of the person. If someone is healthy, able to move around, the effect of loneliness isn't that major on them. On the other hand, if you have someone who's bedridden, right, the possibility and probability of them being very, very lonely is a lot higher. Okay? Which brings us then to the next question, which is, what is it that causes this loneliness? Can something be done to prevent it, or to at least lessen the impact on the elderly? Right? I'm a big believer in approaching things in phases. So let's start with the initial phase of evergreen, right? When people have just left their jobs, the so-called official retirement, right? Generally, in such situations, people tend to cope a lot better, right? And the feeling of loneliness isn't that much. And one of the reasons is they're still very active physically, right? And over a period of time, as they continue to age, you have the body having its own changes. For example, many people tend to lose their hearing. A lot of people, their eyesight goes down. Many people, and we spoke about it in the previous episode as well, tend to forget names, right? Correct. All these factors play a very important role in any social interaction. Right? So what happens is they start hesitating to step out. They start hesitating to go out and meet people. Because one part of them is it's kind of embarrassing to actually meet someone who you've known for so many years and you can't recall their name. Yes. Right? On the other hand, you also feel bad about it because you don't want others to know that, in a sense, your faculties are diminishing. Correct. Right? Similarly, women have a lot of hormonal changes happening. Yes. Right? Most men above the age of 75 have an enlarged prostate, which makes it very uncomfortable for them to go out because they need to use the restroom more often. So there are a lot of physical conditions which are behind their hesitancy to go out. And I think the best way we need to address these issues is at 3 levels. One is by the person who's elderly themselves, being aware of the fact that the body is changing, your outlook to life is changing. Second, the family, especially as Father Juvi mentioned, in this period of Christmas, this period of celebration. It's very natural for the family to want to go out together, socialize a lot more. But as families, we should take a step back, as difficult as that can be sometimes, and see, are we putting too much of pressure, asking the elderly in our family to socialize? Are there other issues behind them not wanting to come out to socialize? And which of these issues are issues which we can address and help them with? And thirdly, I think society, right? Because what are the things we can do as a society? It can be a very simple thing as being more understanding when an elderly person comes for a party. You're taking that extra step to make them feel more comfortable. So at the end of the day, when you actually analyze this topic of loneliness and the so-called, in inverted commas, being unproductive, I think there are so many different facets and dimensions which come into play. You have the physical aspect, you have the emotional, the spiritual aspect, which Father G.V. has started explaining so beautifully. You have the social aspect, and you have the lessons we need to learn from this. And most importantly, I think I need to congratulate the organizers for coming up with this very, very important topic, because statistics also show us that when you have festivals coming up, whether it's Diwali or Christmas, the incidence of loneliness tends to increase.
Yes. Father Juvi, Dr. John spoke about how the elderly could cope and deal with loneliness. What would you like to add to that?
While loneliness is quite prevalent, not all feel comfortable admitting they are lonely.
Correct.
We find it easy to say, I'm tired, I'm exhausted. But to say that I'm lonely, it's not always easy for a number of people.
Yes.
And sometimes when they muster up the courage to admit that, it's not always well received, particularly by the people living at home.
Yes, true.
Some of them will think that they're casting aspersions on them, that they're being judged. What do you mean lonely? We are always there for you. Our neighbors come in and out.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so that little spark of even expressing the pain of loneliness is squashed. And if we do not have persons who would be understanding and patient, they can use harsh words. Yeah, you only pretend in front of others. We throw it at their face. With other people, you pretend to be okay, but you're a real self when you're here with us. And so this adds to the burden and this adds to the pain. Dr. John, you well described as a physician some of these aspects, because that's important for us to really grasp elements that contribute to the feeling of loneliness. There are other factors also. For example, the death of a spouse.
Yes.
You know, this person has been like almost, it's like your whole arm being yanked off. Somebody whom you've lived with such close intimacy and now you just miss that person's presence. Or when you move to a new place or a new city, moving is at the best of times not always easy, but to move your location where you've lived for so long, to move to another place, and you feel disoriented in a new place, you feel quite lonely. At the time of retirement, you know, you were familiar with this office atmosphere, the people who were there, and now you got so much time at home and you never ever were able to establish that kind of connections that came from a daily 9-to-5 routine in the office. So there are many factors that are happening, and it's important for the home or the caregivers to notice these things so that they will understand that. Now, with the seniors also, there are other challenges. Because as you grow older, and as Doctor described so well, the faculties diminish. You do not have those quick responses that you have. Yes. But in your mind, you still think that this is my home is my castle. So don't ever get me moving from there. Okay? Because as we grow older, we have to move from this independence to a kind of interdependence. Because sometimes we can prize our autonomy, our independence so much, while the rest of ourself is going to pieces. They can't maintain their personal hygiene, they can't maintain the hygiene of the house. And they resist every move to come nearer to people who can care for them, particularly in an emergency. But sometimes this desire to just hold on so fiercely to your autonomy to the point that I will die rather than move. Or sometimes emotional blackmail. You move me, I will die.
Yeah.
You get people who say that.
Yes, yes.
And so this is a painful process for them, for the family, and for the caregivers. And here one must be very careful, because those who are outsiders, sometimes these people in their pain will talk about their pain, and outsiders who don't know the bigger picture will start passing judgment on the family without knowing what's happening. And despite the intention to do good, they end up doing harm. Because as you grow older, your faculties and your judgment are not the best. I'm not saying they're lying. I'm not saying anything of that at all. I'm just saying you no longer have the capacity to look after yourself. Because you're at home, and sometimes the justification we will make to stay on, the market is closed. They've not been to the market for months. Okay? The church is closed, but they have not had the energy to go to church. We will use all sorts of justifications to stay where we are. Oh, I've got good neighbors. Yeah, the neighbors might help you for a day, but they're not going to be with you for a... So we will hold on to every justification. What they might call reasons are merely excuses. And so there can be a lot of heartburn happening for that person, the well-wishers of the family members. And so the reason we put out so much of these is to bring a sense of awareness. This is a talk show. It's not a medical program or a fully fledged psychological. It's meant to raise issues, to bring awareness, and to see how each family within its context, and perhaps through some of the shared insights over here, will be able to address some of these real life situations. People will want to stay and not move at all when you can see them just falling to pieces. And then the family members of the children will have to say, okay, when you fall to pieces, all we can do is come and pick up the pieces. Because there is such resistance. And that adds to the loneliness. Because you're trying to battle through life all alone. Anyone who attempts to even... Suspicions are cast on the children or aspersions that they have ulterior motives. Sometimes that might be true, but most of the times it is not. It would be easier for them to just walk away, but when they're making every effort to bring them within the ambit or the ambience of the personal care being present to them, and I think that's so important. So how does one cope with this? Is to come back to your question, unless you thought I forgot it in the midst of all of that.
No.
I think a few things that I would share just from the pastoral experience I've been exposed to with people who've come. First of all is to speak about your loneliness. It's not always easy, but speak with someone. It could be a trusted friend, understanding pastor, maybe the need of a counselor, because once you start talking about it, you're able to look, as I said, the causes might be so varied, but what is your kind of loneliness that you're going through? I think that would be the first thing that you need, because in talking about it, in naming it, you know what exactly you're grappling with. Because loneliness is a big umbrella under which so many causes and reasons might be causing it or provoking it. Speak about it. Second is, what are you going to do about it? Okay? Sometimes you need to actively immerse yourself, depending on the age and the energy. Participate in activities, volunteer in the parishes, offer remedial classes. There are so many things one can do, and find something so that, because when you retire from office, you do not retire from life.
Correct. True, Father.
Sure, that movement continues, and it's so important that you will continue to the extent that you have, the energy that you have, the capacity and the wonderful experience you have gained over the years. How are you going to pass it on? So this whole thing about action, what way can you serve? Sometimes you might not feel like it. Some days you're there. I learned a very good quip years ago. It says, take your body there. Your mind will come later. Because, there are some days, because you've thought this is the kind of activity I want to do. It calls for a certain kind of a discipline. And I think that would be something so important for us to do. To talk about it, to do something about it. And then, of course, always the resources of prayer.
Father Juvi, it is important to grow in solitude. But how do we get there?
Looks like you're already there. The way I see it, and this is my experience, the more you are at home with yourself, you really begin to sense that God will be at home with you.
Yes.
I think, and the more we move into this kind of what we call the prayer of the heart, that's when we experience the richness of solitude. You know, when I conduct prayer experiences during a retreat, the image I use is to descend to the cave of your heart. And it allows you to really feel the sense of God's presence. You know, I will abide in you, the words of Jesus in John's Gospel begin to come alive. And for that, and that's the beauty of solitude, you don't need a silence outside. The silence is inside. I remember conducting this kind of an experience for a group of priests, and the first day was, everything was calm. The next day was Diwali. There were crackers all over the place. But once you entered into the silence, they could have burst 1,000 crackers, didn't mind at all. In fact, this kind of a prayer of solitude of the heart, I've practiced it in trains, on journeys, on flights, because once you visualize yourself getting into the cave of your heart where God dwells, gives you a sense of peace, of knowing that you are alone with the alone. Now, this is an experience that as we grow older and move into more silence, but deeper solitude, we enable it to become part of our lives. I'll draw once again the experience of my dear dad, you know, and because as you grow older, our styles of praying changes and responds to our age. You know, my early years, my father, a very devout man, daily Eucharist, the rosary, devotions, the novena. But then as he grew older and he could not make it for daily mass, he would have his Bible diary. He would read that, reflect, write his little side reflections on the side of the Bible diary. Allowed those words to speak to his heart. Then as he grew older, he found, now from the outside, it looked like he didn't have the concentration to go through an entire rosary. But during the day, you would see him sitting with a contemplative gaze, as it were. Now, I'm looking at it through these eyes. And just that serene presence. So as I look back and analyze it, I see how he has grown through that. Because sometimes people say, as you grow old, I can't concentrate because you want to say all those prayers. I do not have time to say all those prayers. At that time, you just rest in the presence of God. Allow yourself just to be enveloped. We've all learned to be God-fearing people. It's time that we learn to be God-loving people. More than that, allow ourselves to be loved by God.
Correct.
And this contemplative gaze, this resting in solitude, is just knowing that you are loved by God in the depth of your heart. And it gives you that calmness and serenity because God is the still point in a changing world. And I think that is how we allow a solitude experience to become a life-giving experience, a grace-giving experience, and an energizing experience. Oh. And God's grace is so free, so generous, or as we say, plentiful redemption.
Yes.
Father, you have spoken about praying from the mind and praying from the heart. As we age, we spend a lot of time praying and spending time alone with ourselves. And there's a big difference when you pray from your mind and when you pray from your heart. I feel when you pray from your heart, you connect with the divine and you get answers and a lot of solutions to many things. How do we come to that level of, get down to praying from your heart and connecting with the divine?
Thank you for that question, because it reveals a desire and a hunger for a deeper sense of prayer and communion with God. There are different experiences of prayer. In fact, St. Teresa of Avila has divided them into 9 different stages. And I'm sure Sister Josephette, as a Carmelite sister, will probably have something to say on that. But what we have, as you made the distinction between the prayer, the mental prayer, there's vocal prayer, there's mental prayer, there's prayer of the heart, is, if I may draw on another resource that we have already from the Redemptorist Media Center, Teach Us to Pray. In the 3rd episode, we have something of that when Father Larry Kaufman deals precisely with this issue of imagery. Because I spoke about the cave of that, that's the imagery. He speaks about the lowering of the well, the bucket in the well. So I think he not only speaks about it, he leads you through that experience. And maybe that's something that not just you, thank you for raising the question, but others who are participating in this program will find beneficial to tune in to this program, Teach Us to Pray. We've already had 3 episodes. There's more coming your way, so that more and more will have an experience, a deeper experience of being in communion with God, not just with the mind, but as you said, also with the heart.
Father Juvi, you mentioned that the way to deal is to speak about it, to do something about it. But what about the family, Father? How does the family play a part in this? Most of our life is planned by either our parents or by us. But do we plan old age? So I think God wants us to experience old age, and He wants us to make the best of it. So how do the elderly plan their old age?
Thank you for the weighty talk on loneliness, solitude, and being productive. Some of us need to go to that period of loneliness before turning into solitude. Some of us are not able to make that transition. Is that on? Is that okay? How do we know we're stuck in that period of loneliness? Secondly, attached to this is productive. How do you measure being productive? I could be in a state of solitude, be really comfortable with myself, and be productive doing absolutely nothing.
Very good.
Was it autobiographical?
Biography, you're going to sign for it.
Please like and share this video with your friends and family. We value your feedback and comments below. So until next time, it's goodbye from all of us here at Aging Gracefully, a talk show for Evergreens.